Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 4 From Oxford to Karachi, 1950 to 1957. Zulfi's first formal meeting in Oxford was with Christ Church College counsellor Hugh Trevor Roper, now Lord Dacre, who asked the young man what he wanted to study. I said I wanted to study jurisprudence and law. Zulfi replied, upgrading his undergraduate record as he added, I had a summa cum laude from the United States in first class and am, therefore, entitled to finish my schooling in 2 instead of the 3 usual years. Trevor Roper was not quite as easily impressed by Zulfi's bluff confidence as Principal Hammond of Bombay's Cathedral High had been, simply asking the new boy if he knew any Latin. I replied in the negative and he advised me to do my course in 3 instead of 2 years. Latin was a compulsory subject and if I failed in Roman law, I would fail altogether. Who would not have wanted an extra year at Oxford? Zulfi rhetorically asked Pakistan's Supreme Court as he started 3 days of passionate pleading for his life in December of 1978. His Oxford education proved he had the character of a gentleman. When I was leaving, Trevor Roper said to me, You know, even the best brains of our own boys would not be able to do it in 2 years. I turned back and said that I would do it in 2 years because of what he had said, and I would show him that I had brains as good as their boys, if not better. And I did it in 2 years and got high honors. I am a cultivated and educated person. Zulfi's ego could never ignore even the slightest challenge or insult. Trevor Roper's Oxford hauteur and condescension in mentioning even the best brains of our own boys was precisely the sort of gauntlet that blazed scarlet in Zulfi Bhutto's Sindhi Siyasat consciousness. At a later time, Zulfi revealed to Pilo Moody that he still saw Latin in his dreams. Zulfi had in fact crammed Latin so intensely that he developed a repugnance for learning languages that is with him to this day. Pilo reported in 1972. Yet, he proved to Trevor Roper that he had pluck enough to try to match the best British brains, a feat that so favorably impressed the Oxford Don as he soon became one of Zulfi's boon companions and remained a lifelong friend. I remember on one occasion in early 1952, Mumtaz Bhutto recalled when he turned up at London and rang the bell at about 3 o'clock in the morning and was there with the censor of Christ Church, Hugh Trevor Roper, and Robert Blake, who's now Lord Blake. And they came in and sat down and asked for drink. I distinctly remember the remarks of these two distinguished gentlemen. Trevor Roper said, Young man, watch your cousin. He is going very far. So, at that early stage, when he was a student and in many ways a reckless one, those who were teaching him had this opinion. His tutor at Christ Church, Mr. Grant Bailey, also had a very high opinion of him. His presence was there. When he entered a room, all heads would turn, and I felt the same way. I accepted him as a leader and as a man who would have a say in the destiny of the country. Zulfi's self-confidence, at least his appearance of assurance and complete command of a situation, whether political, social or personal, won admiration and support from a remarkably wide spectrum of people the world over. He was witty and charming, handsome and glib, if not brilliant, certainly well-read, well-informed and passionately opinionated, ready at any time of the day or night to drink, argue, laugh, or make love. He was one of those fortunate young people of high birth and great wealth, for whom the world becomes a movable feast of fine foods and rare wines. For a variety of reasons, however, in Zulfi's case, perhaps because of the color bar that kept him from the best rooms and restaurants in the United States, or the monumental ignorance and indifference to Pakistan and Pan-Islam that he found in the West. He felt it his personal destiny to lead his land and its hungry millions towards a happier horizon and greater world recognition. The incongruous blend of his feudal genetic load covered over with a thin veneer of socialist ideals, acquired from his studies and from personal exposure to prejudice of every sort, conspired to help Zulfi resolve during his years overseas to devote his life to global political diplomacy at the helm of Pakistan. Had he not gone abroad to complete his education, it is more than probable, given his father's experience and inherited siyasat shrewdness, that Zulfi would in any event have embarked upon a political career in Karachi. His ambitions then would have been less grand, confined perhaps to the chief ministership of Sindh or membership in the Pakistan Central Cabinet. Because of the University of Southern California, the University of California, and Oxford University, the world became his stage and premier power, the pearl he sought in every oyster he pried open. Zulfi returned to Karachi after the spring term of 1951. He immediately told Nusrat that for all these 2 years I've been thinking of you. He had dispatched a friend that year before with a message from Zulfikar, but she had feigned ignorance of who the sender might be. Which Zulfikar? Indeed, he was not the only Pakistani named Sod. But the report other studied indifference fired Zulfi's resolve to marry her. He would prove his worth to her, as he had to Hammond and Trevor Roper. He would conquer the Iranian beauty as he was going to conquer Latin. Nusrat herself had completed only senior Cambridge exams at the convent school of Jesus and Mary in Bombay, never starting college. Yet she was worldly wise. I was happy, but I tried not to show it, she confessed when she thought back to the first time he proposed marriage. I went to the door to see him out and said, I thought you were joking. He got mad and said, Damn it, I'm serious. I'll have to go back to study and I want to finish it off now. I have no time, not enough time. So then, of course, I had to tell my sister and my parents wouldn't agree. How can you marry him? We are Iranians and they are Sindhis. My mother had already died when I was 15 years old. We were modern, our parents were more broad minded. They had taught us what was good and bad, and they trusted us. I never stayed out after midnight, but he wanted to get married, so I finally agreed. Now it was Zulfi's parents who protested. Sir Shah Nawaz was shocked, though not Zulfi's mother, who knew Nusrat and liked her, but nonetheless thought her a bit too modern minded for her precious son. Would any woman have been good enough for him? Finally, in frustration and rage, Zulfi gave up arguing with his parents, bought a ticket for Nusrat to accompany him to London, and came to her one evening, bags packed. But I said, How can I elope? I can't come like that. We both cried and we were feeling so sad, Nusrat remembered. Then a friend of Zulfi's turned up with a jeep and told them, Look, I'm married. I married a Hindu girl and then we went to the mosque to give them courage to act. He drove them out toward Malir, where there was a mosque and said, Why don't you two go and marry with the Maulvi? Nusrat got such a fright that she cried, I can't do that. My parents, my father, turn back. I'm going back home. She wanted a proper wedding. They took her back and Zulfi spent the night at that friend's home. When his parents heard nothing from him the next day, they were frantic with fear for his life. Finally, his mother came crying to our home. Ki, where is my son? He can marry anyone he wants. Nusrat wasn't sure where he had gone, suggesting that he might have flown back to London because he had shown her the tickets. Knowing how stubborn and emotional their son could be, his parents accepted reality. They rushed home and they returned to Nusrat with a ring and jewelry and said, Get married. Within the week, Zulfi and Nusrat were man and wife. It was a small wedding for so important a Karachi couple. celebrated on 8th September 1951. Nusrat wore an embroidered bridal gharara, traditional long skirt and jewellery. Zulfi rejected the traditional bridegroom's achnak coat and turban, wearing instead an elegant black suit with a folded handkerchief in his pocket. They were married at the Bhutto home on McNeil Road in Karachi, and the following days passed in a whirl of luncheons and dinners. But week's end, Zulfi, his mother, and his bride left Pakistan for London, stopping over in Turkey to visit Zulfi's half sister, who was married to Colonel Mustafa Khan, Pakistan's military attaché in Istanbul. Mother in law came with me, Nusrat recalled, for though this was his second marriage, Zulfi's mother could not as yet let go of her darling son. So we three travelled together to Istanbul, then from there to Rome. Zulfi's mother had at last turned back, so we were alone in London for the first time. Their suite at the Dorchester, where they stayed for a week, overlooked Hyde Park. One evening, they saw Mary Martin in South Pacific and loved it. Zulfi was fond of musicals but liked classical music, especially Beethoven, as well as popular music. He enjoyed acting of every variety and was himself an excellent mimic. One of his oldest Sindhi friends, Muzaffar Hussain, thought he should have been an actor. He would have been the greatest actor the world had ever known. Others, who admired Zulfi less than Muzaffar did, said that in fact he was. Zulfi and his new Begum reached Oxford just in time for the fall term. He moved Nusrat into a small hotel near Christ Church, but because he had to return to the college every night by 11, when the gates were locked, there was not the usual first year of married life. I didn't like the Mitre Hotel because the floors used to creak. It was dark and I had to go alone to my room. So then he took me to a more modern hotel. One night they went to a club and stayed so late that Zulfi could not make it back to Christ Church in time for bed check. The next day, Trevor Roper asked the reason, and when Zulfi told him, he exclaimed, "I can't believe you're married." Nusrat recalled, "So I was brought and then he let Zulfi off and we became friendly." Nusrat lived in Oxford for almost 3 months. Everyone was still on short rations in England. There was virtually no meat available and few eggs, nor could Nusrat cook, for she had never been obliged to learn. Zulfi, who had lived with Pilo, of course knew quite well how to cook, but had little time for it. Letters from both families urged Nusrat to return to Pakistan. Her father and sisters missed her very much, and his parents wanted her to let their son study more. "They didn't realize that if I'm there, I would make him study," Nusrat noted, especially Latin, on which she kept drilling and questioning him. By late November, she headed home to live with her in-laws on McNeil Road in a house they had named Benazir, without equal, incomparable. That was a trying time for the newlyweds. Zulfi wrote regularly, and though it was more difficult in those days, he occasionally phoned. "Why don't you tell my father to send you here?" Nusrat was too scared of Sir Shahnawaz, whose health had deteriorated considerably by then, making him more cranky. He agreed with his wife, moreover, that their son would study more if alone. Finally, Nusrat's father saw how unhappy she was, how much she missed being with her husband, so he bought a ticket for her to fly to London in mid-1952. Zulfi by then had completed residence requirements at Christ Church and was permitted to move to London. He still had to work on Latin, which he continued to study while he was enrolled at Lincoln's Inn, reading for the bar and eating the requisite number of dinners there, even as Jinnah had done 60 years before. Nusrat shared his furnished flat on the 6th floor in Chatsworth Court, Kensington, for a month, while he commuted between London and Oxford. He used to do some cooking. She remembered, "I learned to go to the butcher. I told him I don't want pork, so he would give me some eggs or whatever. Nonetheless, most nights they ate out. Zulfi enjoyed French cuisine, and Nusrat was indifferent. When one is so much in love, you don't know what you're eating, what you're doing. Zulfi confided to his wife his ambition to be the foreign minister. He talked about going to the Foreign Office after he finished his studies and returned home. After the month in London, Zulfi and Nusrat moved to Oxford, where they stayed for 2 more months. It was there that a doctor confirmed her suspicion that she was pregnant. Zulfi was so excited, he was running in the streets, picking me up and sort of carrying me, dancing in the streets. To every stranger they met, Zulfi exulted, You know, I'm going to be a father. I'm going to have a child. He could scarcely contain his excitement and pleasure. Nusrat returned to Pakistan alone. Zulfi had only the bar to worry about once he finished Latin and was awarded a Master of Arts degree with honors. There were balls for him to speak at and moots to attend in Lincoln's Great Hall. Rhetoric and debate were Zulfi's best subjects, but by 1953, Lincoln's Inn bar examinations required a grounding in constitutional law, jurisprudence, evidence, criminal law, remedies, land law, civil procedure, conflict of laws, criminal procedure, partnership, divorce, master and servant law, construction, and torts. Zulfi worked up all those subjects from among any of which he might be questioned during that final multi day ordeal. He drew up lengthy, precise outlines on every legal subject, the high points underlined in red, green, and blue, each filed in its labeled folder. Less than a year after being enrolled in Lincoln's Inn, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was called to the bar there, as William Pitt, Lord Canning, John Morley, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah had been before him. What an exalted fraternity he'd joined, that band of barristers who had dined in the hallowed Great Hall and passed through the weathered stone portals of the inn, named for Thomas de Lincoln and founded in the 14th century. Barrister Bhutto was apprenticed in the chambers of Ash Lincoln, Q.C. Christmas. Toby Humphreys was the head of the chambers at the time, and Barrister Eric Hurst, then a Labour member of London's County Council, who had earlier spent many hours with Sir Shahnawaz, of whom I was found was Zulfi's mentor in the chambers. Hurst said some 35 years later, we shared a certain proclivity for being rather less concerned with doctrinaire politics than with practical solutions to palpable evils. He made no claim to having played even a small part in Bhutto's stupendous ascent to greatness. But he did note that when he had time to spare for our discussions on law, Zulfi's mind was among the brightest, most perceptive, and most analytical I have known. It appears, however, that Zulfi did not often find time to spare for the law. Hurst attributed his distraction when in chambers to what Zulfi told him was work he'd been doing on a proposal for a new agrarian policy for Pakistan. Zulfi once showed Hurst a draft of that scheme, trying to explain perhaps why he had been remiss in his legal labors. He was driven, Hurst concluded, perhaps sometimes impetuously, but always, I believe, sincerely by compassion. All I think the young Zulfi I knew ever wanted was to procure for his country what he perceived to be its true manifest destiny, peace with honor and a sufficiency for all. Nusrat was living at Benazir in Karachi when her first child, Benazir, was born on 21st June 1953. The choice of name was my in-laws, Begum Nusrat recalled. The doting grandparents usually called her Nazir, but Nusrat always used the full Benazir. Her aunt called her Pinky because she had been very pink at birth and that was to remain her family nickname. She was a beautiful child, and felt surprisingly heavy to the new mother. Zulfi must have been pleased at the good news, but even so, continued his work in London till year's end. His father's friend, Professor S. N. Grant Bailey of Christ Church, had just appointed Zulfi a part time assistant lecturer on the law faculty of Southampton University. Grant Bailey wrote to convey that information to Sir Shahnawaz from London in August, adding, I greatly regret that the necessity of his returning home at the end of this year will confine his lecturing life here to one term. I am confident that his lecturing will be of value from many angles. Zulfi was, however, unable to start lecturing at Southampton before steaming home from that port in November, contrary to the note on his life in the Biographical Encyclopedia of Pakistan. Barrister Bhutto returned to Karachi on the same P&O liner that future Justice Dorab Patel, who had been called to the bar after finishing his studies at London School of Economics, had also booked a berth. He looked me up on board, Dorab Patel said 36 years later. Soon after reaching home, the two young barristers shared an office on the top floor of renowned solicitor Ram Chandani Dingomal's chambers in the old Indian Airlines building facing Karachi's Municipal Court House. Sir Shahnawaz had known Dorab's Parsi uncle Moody in Bombay, the eminent justice of Pakistan's Supreme Court, who would be one of the minority of three judges voting to acquit Zulfi Bhutto of conspiring to murder a political opponent, recalled that we did not have much in common. Nor did he see very much of Zulfi in Dingomal's chambers, because he rarely arrived until early evening, by which time Patel had usually gone home. Their working hours must have overlapped enough, however, for Patel to feel the need to have a glass partition installed between their cubicles. I like to have privacy, the soft-spoken justice explained. Benazir was almost 6 months old when her father glimpsed her for the first time as he came down the gangway to his waiting family. I had the baby, but he ignored it. Begum Nusrat remembered. He was too shy, but when we went home, he said, Now let me see my child. And of course he loved it. So I said, Why then did you ignore her? He said, In front of my parents, they'll think I'm too weak. They'll think what I'm doing, looking after carrying a baby, but in the house he kept looking at the face, the hands. She was a beautiful child. He soon went off to Larkana to visit his first wife and to check on his lands. He liked to spend 3 or 4 winter months in Larkana, inviting many foreign as well as Pakistani friends there for the hunting season and to celebrate his birthday. He returned to Karachi to practice law in Dingomal's chambers. His first case, according to Begum Nusrat, was to defend a fellow Sindhi charged with murder. Bhutto won the case, but because his client had no money, he gave Bhutto his little girl. So he brought the child home to me and said, Look what he gave me. How could he give his own child? So I said, Take it back. So he did. Zulfi had met Dingomal's son at Oxford, where he had been a student at Oriel College. Young Dingomal, now a famous lawyer in Karachi, was to represent the Bhutto family in a number of personal matters. He remembered the first time he heard Zulfi speak in Oxford at a Rotary Club meeting. He said he was going to be the foreign minister of Pakistan, and all of us said, What an ambitious young man. Zulfi's ambition had long focused on politics and diplomacy, which helps perhaps to explain why he took so little interest in his legal practice. Barrister Fakhruddin Ibrahim, later Chief Justice of Pakistan's Supreme Court and after his retirement, Governor of Sindh, 1989 to 1990, also practiced in Dingomal's chambers, where he met Zulfi. Zulfi turned many of his cases over to Ibrahim, who had been called to the bar from the inner temple and was most diligent in his daily application to the career from which he never deviated till after retirement. He remembered Zulfi as very generous but always sensed a streak of violence in him, a certain mean or vindictive quality. Zulfi joined the bar in Karachi and became a member of the prestigious Sindh Club, where he liked to drop in for a drink or a meal with his friends in the old high-ceilinged Victorian palace. His ambition to run the foreign ministry naturally predisposed him towards issues of constitutional law. He occasionally lectured on the subject in Karachi's Sindh Muslim Law College and wrote papers on constitutional questions that at the time were being vigorously argued in the clubs and assemblies of Karachi and Lahore. By 1954, Pakistan's Constituent Assembly had been wrestling for 7 years with its still unwritten constitution in its search to reconcile fundamental regional and tribal differences within its complex, divided body politic. The elusive constitution would have to be acceptable both to the representatives of some 56% of Pakistan's Bengali population who lived in the east and to the 28% in the west's large province Punjab, which also provided almost 85% of the nation's recruits for the army and higher civil bureaucracy. Sindhis, frontier Pathans, and Balochis clamored, moreover, for special provincial considerations of their own. 7 years had not been long enough to reconcile the many differences among all these discrete cohorts. Nor had the preceding 7 years interlude from the Muslim League's adoption in March 1940 of its famous Lahore Resolution to the traumatic birth of the Dominion of Pakistan in mid-August 1947 sufficed to permit Quaid-e-Azam Jinnah and his advisers to formulate clear guidelines for the constitutional character of the nation they sponsored. Jinnah himself was dying of lung cancer and tuberculosis by the time he returned to Karachi as Pakistan's first Governor General. What little he said about the constitution he envisaged for his nation indicates that he hoped it might be democratic, based on Islamic foundations of social justice, equality, and brotherhood of man. 2 days after returning to his birthplace, Karachi, Governor General designate Jinnah told assembled followers in Karachi Club, "Let us trust each other. With the help of every section, I see that every class is represented in the huge gathering. Let us work in double shift, if necessary, to make the sovereign state of Pakistan really happy, really united, and really powerful." Such inspirational generalizations were all he ever articulated, though his first address to the new Constituent Assembly on 11th August 1947, shortly before he died, was his longest constitutional legacy and the closest Jinnah ever came to explaining how he hoped the Pakistan of his dreams might one day function. The first duty of a government is to maintain law and order, so that the life and property and religious beliefs of its subjects are fully protected. The second thing is bribery and corruption. That really is a poison. We must put that down with an iron hand. Black marketing is another curse. The next thing is the evil of nepotism and jobbery. This evil must be crushed relentlessly. If we take our inspiration and guidance from the Holy Quran, the final victory will be ours. Be prepared to sacrifice all, if necessary, in building up Pakistan as a bulwark of Islam and as one of the greatest nations whose ideal is peace. Now, if we want to make this great state of Pakistan happy and prosperous, we should wholly and solely concentrate on the well-being of the people and especially of the masses and the poor. If you change your past and work together in a spirit that every one of you, no matter to what community he belongs, no matter what relations he had with you in the past, no matter what is his color, caste or creed, is first, second and last a citizen of this state with equal rights and privileges and obligations, there will be no end to the progress you will make. We should begin to work in that spirit. And in course of time, all these peculiarities of the majority and minority communities, the Hindu community and the Muslim community, will vanish. We are all citizens and equal citizens of one state.